Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 433 for the 7th of Shevat in a regular year. So I have a question for you guys. Does God talk? Does God speak? What do you think? So we've all heard stories of people saying that God spoke to them, right? Some of these people maybe were delusional, but that's what they experienced. That's what they felt. We also know that there were prophets throughout history who actually, we do describe that we do believe that God actually spoke to them. We see throughout the Torah, the statement, and God spoke. God said to Moshe, saying this. That's a very famous phrase in that we find numerous times throughout the Torah. Is God spoke to Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe le'emor, that God spoke to Moshe saying. Right. We also know that we've spoken about this before, that the way that God actually created the world was through speech, the 10 utterances of creation. So it seems from all of this that indeed God does speak, right? But at the same time, have you or I actually heard the voice of God? What does that sound like even? What is that? When we talk about God's speech, is it the same thing as our speech? If not, why do we call it speech? If yes, why have none of us heard God speak before? So all of this is going to be the topic of today's episode is, does God speak? If it's seemingly yes, God does speak, what is the speech of God? How do we define it as speech? Why do we call it speech if it's obviously so different from human speech, and all of that? So today we're actually going to be beginning a new chapter 21, and it's a really nice continuation from the previous chapter that we learned in the past couple of episodes, chapter 20. Please go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't already, or go back and review. And what we discussed in those two episodes in chapter 20 was this idea of how it is that the uniqueness of God in terms of the way that he creates the world, and what really differentiates him in the biggest way from humans and the way that we create things, is that first of all, God remains unchanged by his creation. He does not remain affected, versus anything that we do, anything that we create changes and affects us in some way. For God, he doesn't get affected. He doesn't get changed by his creations. He's the same as he was before he was created and after he was created. And we explained that the reason for this is because all of God's creations are considered to be naught and nothing in comparison to him. And so yesterday we were describing this idea that as much as it is difficult for us to relate to this because we're not God and we're very different than God, obviously, we can kind of have a little bit of a semblance of understanding how all of this works through looking at our speech, through looking at the speech of man as a sort of like a metaphor for the interplay of all of this. And we spoke about how our speech is really like, when we say any particular word or any particular phrase, that speech is really nullified to us, to who we are on a deep level. And we went through a whole process of like really exploring the chain of events of how this happens, and how whatever it is that we're speaking is actually originating in the letters of speech that it's sort of like our faculty of speech, which is like infinite in comparison to what it is that we actually speak. And that faculty of speech is actually coming from our thought, and those thoughts are actually coming from our desire in our heart, and the desire in our heart is actually coming from our mind, which generates that desire. Like the recognition of the value of something is what makes us want it. So we were kind of like led through this whole chain reaction process back, making us really recognize and come to the conclusion that our speech is really nothing in comparison to who we are. And so this can kind of give us a semblance of how it is that God's creation, which God created through his speech, is really nothing in comparison to him. And just like we remain unchanged by our speech, like, I'm speaking these words, but it doesn't essentially change who I am. It's similar to that in the same way that God creates the world, but it's just like his speech. It's not essentially who he is. It's like God's speech and him are not the same, just like my speech and me are not one and the same. But today we're going to really explore how, as much as this it's a really helpful analogy to help us understand God's process of creation, we have to also recognize that it is just an analogy. And ultimately, our speech and God's speech are not the same, and they're actually extremely different. And the essential difference between the two things is that when it comes down to it, even though, yes, my speech is really like totally nullified and nothing in comparison to who I really am, my speech has some kind of tangible, maybe not tangible in the sense that you can actually touch it, but it has some kind of existence apart from me. I mean, this podcast is a really good example of this, right? Like, I pre-record these episodes and then you're listening to it on a day, like, right now I'm recording the episode for the 7th of Shevat, but it's actually the 1st of Shevat when I'm recording this episode. It's a week in advance. So interestingly, when you're going to listen to this podcast, I might be off doing something totally different. I might be sleeping. I might be eating. I might be doing something, just living my life, but yet you're listening to my voice. So somehow my voice has this has taken on a separate existence than me. Sure, we can argue, it's a recording of my voice. It's not actually my voice, but even just my voice, even if you're, talking to me just in real time, there's my voice and there's me. There's the words I say and there's me. They're two separate things. Versus, as we'll see, when it comes to God, this separation is not there. It's not present. God is one and unified with his speech, and there is no separate, entity, separate existence of his speech apart from him. So let's see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. And again, for context, we're beginning today chapter 21 of Likkutei Amarim. And the Alter Rebbe begins by telling us very clearly that God's nature is not like the nature of man. So again, we gave this really nice metaphor yesterday about man's speech versus, which is really similar to God's speech in the sense that our speech is nullified to who we are and all that stuff. But when it comes to man, when a person says something, then this voice, their voice, their breath, it appears to have a separate existence than the person. There's the person and then there's their voice. It's two different things, right? Versus when it comes to God, God's speech is not separate from him because, as we've already learned, there is nothing separate from God. So God forbid that we should say that there's God and then his speech. His speech thus must be unified with him, must be just connected with him in a very intimate way and not something separate from him. So thus now we understand that God's speech is not, God forbid, like our speech. And this is similar, says the Alter Rebbe, to the idea of how it is that God's thoughts are not like our thoughts. And he brings a citation to support this. This is from Yeshayahu, chapter 55, verse 8, where it says, Ki lo machshavotay machshavotecha, my thoughts are not like your thoughts. And also another citation, also from Yeshayahu, chapter 55 verse 9, right after that, where it says, Ken gavhu drachai midrachichem, that my ways are loftier than your ways. So meaning to say that it's like, this Yeshayahu is teaching us that God's thoughts are not like our thoughts, and the Alter Rebbe is saying just like God's thoughts are not like our thoughts, so too is God's speech unlike our speech. So then the question comes up, if God's speech is really unlike our speech, why do we call it speech? Like, that seems weird. Give it another name. Say it's God's blah, blah, blah. I don't know, like something else, right? So why do we call it speech? So the Alter Rebbe explains, he says, when we use the word speech, we're actually just using it as by way of parable. So meaning to say that there's something about human speech that we can understand allegorically. It can teach us something about God's speech. It sort of works in this like allegorical fashion. So what's the purpose of human speech? Why do we speak? What are we doing when we're speaking? We're revealing to the listeners something which is concealed in our thoughts, right? So it's like the whole idea, like there's these like science fiction books and movies about this idea we're all going to read thoughts, and we're just going to live in this like ESP kind of place, and we'll just sit around all day and like listen to each other's thoughts. So we're not living in that reality right now anyways. So if you're with a friend, if you're with a loved one, or if you're with anybody, really, if you want to let them know what it is that you're thinking, you have to speak. The speaking is what reveals your thoughts to whoever it is that you're with. So this is similar to what God does. So when God wants to reveal his light and his vitality to from out of concealment into revelation, which is really what's involved in creating the worlds. Like, what is it? What are worlds? Worlds are a revelation of God, of godliness. This is called speech. So this is why we say that this is the idea of speech. And this is like, now we can understand the 10 utterances through which the world was created. It's that it makes a lot of sense, because if we're now defining speech, or we're understanding speech to be revealing that which is usually concealed, then we can understand that this is the idea. This is why the world was actually created through God's quote unquote speech. And so too, not only the creation of all the worlds, but also the whole Torah and Nevi'im and Ketuvim, like the entire Tanakh, that when we say that the Nevi'im, like, how do we have the Tanakh? How do we have the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim? We have it all written down because the prophets wrote it down, and they received this revelation through God. And this is why the revelation actually came down through speech, through letters, through words that we find in these holy books. So again, it's like God's speech is similar to our speech in the sense that it reveals what would otherwise be concealed, but it's different than our speech in the sense that our speech has a kind of life of its own, versus for God, it does not. For God, his speech is one with himself. Now, a way that we can kind of understand this unity of God's speech within himself, is actually, again, looking at ourselves, but not necessarily in terms of manifest speech, but in terms of when we think about the level of speech and thought that's found within ourselves, before we actually reveal it into revelation, before we actually speak the words out loud. So when it's found in our mind, right? So there's, again, going back to that process of like, before we actually say anything, how is it that I'm able to say these words? Because somewhere in my mind, I'm formulating, it's happening really quickly, but I'm formulating these words into sentences, the letters into words that become sentences. And it's coming from my mind, because my mind knows these ideas. Like, I go and I study the Tanya is in my mind. I figure out a way that I want to give it over to you guys. And then that gets translated into speech. So the speech part is what's manifest to you guys. And the speech part is what is manifest as something separate from me. But within myself, before I've actually spoken the words out loud, before I've actually given over my thoughts, then the speech and thoughts are actually unified within myself, right? And they're either unified within my mind, where it is that I'm like, these thoughts are originating from, and the speech is originating from, or you could say that they're originating in my heart. So it's like, if I want to say certain things, if I want to communicate certain things, it's going to be found in my heart, and even in that place, also, it's going to be unified with me. So these are sort of the two channels by which speech comes about. My speech, when I am speaking words, it's either coming from a place of intellect, where there's an idea that I've come to understand and I want to express that idea over to you guys, or there's just, I have this like want, this really strong desire to communicate something. Maybe it's an emotional thing, and I need to tell you how I feel. In that case, it's going to be coming from my heart. So in both of those cases, though, then before the speech actually becomes manifest into and gets expressed into real time, into the world, then the speech is and the thoughts are actually connected with me, are connected to their source, whether it's in my mind or whether it's in my heart. And so this is a way that we can kind of understand God's speech. This is the conclusion here, is that for God, when we talk about God's speech, it's we call it speech because it is just like our speech. It's a revelation of something going on the inside with God. But unlike our speech, it actually never leaves the inside of God. So it's sort of like the level of speech where for us, it's like happening on the inside before it actually manifests to the outside. So God's speech never leaves the inside, because God's speech, there's nothing apart from him, which means it's always happening inside of God. So it's really hard to grasp this, because it's sort of it's beyond our comprehension to really grasp it fully, because we're in this experience of God's speech. We're all being created something for nothing all the time through God's speech. And it's this weird kind of like paradox of like, so we aren't God, we are God's speech, right? But God's speech is one with him. So there's nothing apart from God. And this is the idea in Chassidus, is like these ideas, really understanding God is ultimately beyond our comprehension, but yet we try as best as we can to kind of stretch our intellect to its limits, to try to give us this appreciation for godliness, and for God as much as we can. So this is what it is. So in conclusion, does God talk? Yes, he does. But when we say talk or speech, it's sort of like a borrowed term, and it's sort of like our speech, but it's not exactly the same thing. And it's important to understand the differences between our speech and God's speech. So that's it for today, and we'll continue along these lines tomorrow, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.